Well, thank you, Dan, and I thank the Commission and the task force for sponsoring this important forum. I'm grateful to be included in this panel, which includes people with far deeper expertise in healthcare than I possess. I will make two preparatory observations. First, although it may go without saying, my remarks this evening reflect only my personal viewpoint and not that of the University of Idaho. And secondly, I don't carry a partisan banner here. Rather, my purpose is to step away briefly from the policy issues that Tim so cogently described in the Skype presentation. And I'll try to illuminate both the advantages and the disadvantages of framing a discussion of healthcare policy in terms of a human right. The word right often appears in healthcare discourse as part of a polemical statement, such as healthcare is a right, not a privilege, or healthcare is a transaction in goods and services, not a right. These contrasting statements, seems to me, reflect different perspectives on what we mean by a right. One perspective is that a right is an expression of individual autonomy. The idea that a community, acting through government, cannot deprive an individual of a fundamental freedom, such as freedom of expression, freedom of religious exercise, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, and so on. This freedom from perspective is reflected in the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights. The concept of a right to health care does not easily fit, and may not fit at all, within this freedom from perspective. In any event, such a right is not found in the text of the Constitution. By way of illustration, although I realize this is a dark analogy these days, the Second Amendment has been held by the Supreme Court to contain a freedom from government infringement upon an individual right to possess a firearm. But the Second Amendment does not oblige the government to provide the firearm. Now, a contrasting perspective is that a right is an individual entitlement, which a community is obliged to honor and to fulfill to the extent possible or feasible. This entitlement perspective was reflected in President Franklin Roosevelt's famous address, in which, as many of you will recall, he called for a second Bill of Rights that would include freedom from fear and freedom from want, the latter of which would include a right to health and an implied concomitant right of access to health care. A similar perspective appeared a few years later in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an aspirational statement, not having the legal effect of a treaty. Two treaties did follow in 1966. One was the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which recognized, quote, the right of everyone to enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, unquote. But the treaty was and still is vague on what specifically a nation must do in order to attain this highest attainable standard. There is no enforcement standard or mechanism. The other treaty was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which also referred to health and health care. However, the treaty itself allowed participating nations to ratify, quote, with reservations, unquote. And that is what the United States did, reserving unto itself its authority to decline to carry out any obligation that, quote, contains more protections than those provided in the United States Constitution, the text of which, as we've already seen, does not include a right to health care. So back to square one. Many other nations have constitutional rights to health care. South Africa is an example. Or statutory schemes that, in effect, embody a right to health care. Canada is the most visible example. If such a right does not exist in the United States, the question is, should one be created? Supporters of an American constitutional or national statutory right to health care have several arguments, and I can't embrace them all here. But they include that establishing such a right to fulfill a moral duty of society, or would fulfill a moral duty, especially of a society that possesses the resources to provide at least a baseline or adequate health care for everyone. They argued that such a right, if recognized in law, would galvanize the reallocation of scarce health care resources that are now being inefficiently consumed by the current healthcare system. They argued that it would make public policy decisions on healthcare more accountable and more transparent. Opponents have their own arguments, and they include the difficulty, obviously, of securing the adoption of such a sweeping constitutional amendment or national statute. The problem of injecting the courts, which are supposed to be independent, impartial, substantially insulated from the politics of the day, from making politically charged decisions about the implementation of such a national law and the allocation of resources thereunder. They argue what might be called the libertarian side of the moral question, using the power of government to compel one individual or group to provide or to pay taxes in order to provide certain commodities, as they would characterize them, healthcare goods and services, to other individuals or groups. This was an ideological clash, a clash of community and libertarian values, and it is sharpest when the subject of discussion is framed as a right rather than as a problem to be solved. The rights perspective has the advantage of stimulating debate. It's a tool for critical thinking and evaluation of policy proposals, and I suppose for that reason it generates great interest among pundits and scholars. But it also has the disadvantage of rigidifying public discourse, because ideology does not yield readily to empirical analysis or to consensus building. It illuminates, but it also perpetuates the ongoing controversy about healthcare policy in America. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Don. So, Don, thank you for the references, and so what I hear you saying is it may be right, it may not, it isn't right now, and I'm not sure answering that question is going to help us solve the problem.
I think it shapes the discourse of the problem in a way that can interfere with getting to the solution.
Thank you.